goes without saying, South Africans continue to feel the pinch due to the high cost of living, and economists are warning that there may be no relief on the horizon. Adverse economic conditions mean that South Africa is still far from an interest rate cut cycle. Let's talk about it with Investec Chief Economist Annabel Bishop. Annabel, good morning. Before we actually get into some of the merits around, what's affecting, the state of interest rates and why we potentially will not be seeing not even an interest rate cut, but yet alone an interest rate cutting cycle, is the concept of interest rates and inflation. So just share with our viewers a really simple way of understanding how inflation does have an impact on where the interest rate goes and how, and how it moves.
Yes. Look, I think there still will be an interest rate cut cycle. It will be moved out. But to understand inflation and interest rates, essentially what inflation is, it's the year-on-year change in prices. So they look at a basket of goods that people consume and services, typically for, South Africa as a whole for consumers, and they look at the change in all the prices of those goods in 1 month for this year compared to the same month as last year. As we know, the inflation rate is quite high. It's at 5.6% in the latest print. And of course, that was for February. So that high rate is well removed from the 4.5%, which the Reserve Bank wishes it to be at under inflation targeting. This is not an unusual phenomena. In the United States, they also have their inflation rate higher than what their central bank is trying to get it to. So that's really the relationship between inflation and interest rates.
All right. So, if you think about it, if you could get 10 things with your rand, now you can only get 5 things for your rand. Would that be inaccurate, or is it too oversimplifying what it is?
That depends, obviously, if you're not seeing salary and wage increases yourself. And, of course, if they're not keeping up with inflation. So, really, what we're finding in South Africa is the South African Reserve Bank seeks to control inflation by pushing up or lowering interest rates. And, of course, what they're saying is until inflation is at this 4.5% mark, they're not looking to cut interest rates in South Africa.
We're going to come to, again, some of the influences, but interest rates directly influence many things, like the cost of borrowing for businesses and individuals. So when interest rates are high, that borrowing becomes more expensive, and it can have a negative impact, like reducing investment. People spend less. A lot of people have limited access to credit. Talk to us about the negative impacts of high interest rates.
Yes. So high interest rates are supposed to have negative impacts. The South African Reserve Bank and central banks around the world raise interest rates and then keep them high when inflation is not under control. And they do this in order to curb the ability for consumers to spend, for businesses to spend, for the indebted to spend overall, in order to obviously get the population, the businesses, consumers, to not accept continuous price increases coming through from, for example, the retail sector, but instead to pull back a bit on expenditure. And that, of course, then is seen to have some mollifying effect on the pace of inflation itself.
Now, what a lot of us are hoping for is that there will be some relief. And as you said, it's not that there won't be interest rate cuts or the beginning of a cycle. There just might be a delay. And before we talk to your projections around when in the year we can begin to see that, because we associate interest rate cuts with relief, for our pockets and our bonds and things like that. But what are some of the factors globally that are affecting the way interest rates are moving in South Africa? Some of us find it hard to believe that the moves made by global banks will have an effect on us.
Well, one of the factors that's affecting us is obviously high international oil prices. And of course, South Africa doesn't produce its own oil. It imports oil and petroleum products. And of course, that's also affected by the exchange rate. And that's why we have petrol price increases, which has contributed to higher inflation this year. Also, of course, as well, if you see upward pressure on international food prices, that also has an effect on South Africa. Now, South Africa does produce its own food, but of course, it is priced against international agricultural prices. So there's two feed-through effects that come through from the global economy. But of course, what's happening in the United States, that they're looking to delay their interest rate that cycle, the start of it, because obviously of their high inflation rates, so well removed from their target. Our South African Reserve Bank says it doesn't follow the United States. If our inflation rate is at 4.5% and then it started to drop below that, started to move towards the 4% mark, perhaps even below 4%, they would look to cut interest rates pretty quickly. So I think, there's not a direct link, but where the link comes through is with the rand. And of course, if the United States finds itself in a position where obviously it doesn't cut interest rates, and South Africa does cut interest rates before the US, that can obviously cause some rand weakness, because obviously it's reducing return for investors. But I think just returning to inflation and South Africans, while inflation is high now, it is expected to come down as we move through the course of this year. And of course, in the second half of this year, we do expect to see interest rate cuts beginning.
When? I know, economists don't like the concept of a crystal ball, because there can be a number of moves, as you say. We externally, we exist in an environment that has so many different factors around it. But when credibly could we begin to start seeing that?
So we've got a forecast for September for the first 25 basis point cut in interest rates. Of course, it may be pushed out to November if inflation just stays sticky, if it doesn't fall down towards that 4.5% mark. And, that's obviously the risk. One of the factors is, of course, that we've had a very dry February, very hot months of January, February and March. And of course, lack of rain in those periods have had a very negative effect on grain crop production. And there's been a couple of estimates coming out from the committee that looks at that for South Africa. They've revised it down twice. There's a risk we could see it revised down further. And of course, low production of maize in particular. And there is some risk that we might get some upward pressure on food prices later this year that wasn't anticipated. And that's where this risk comes from, particularly for a delay in the start of the interest rate cut cycle for South Africa.
So make something simple for us, Linda. And this is, the SARB, and, we've had various conversations about the meetings that the MPC has and then the decisions it makes regarding rates. And the SARB, variously has been accused of using the decisions it makes on the interest rates as an inflation cutting tool. They have said that inflation must be brought under control and won't cut rates until it happens. So how do you see, that dynamic playing out?
The South African Reserve Bank does use interest rates as a tool to control inflation, and they have said they're not going to cut until inflation reaches 4.5%. But not only that, they're not going to cut until inflation is also expected to sustainably remain around 4.5%. So they want to see a few months of it remaining around 4.5%. This actually brings up the risk that there might not be any interest rate cuts at all this year.
Well, I want to come back to that, because that was kind of like a cliffhanger of that possibility being there. But is that the right approach, using interest rates as an inflation cutting tool?
Yes, it's what's used around the world. It's international best practice, and it is very effective as well. When it is not so effective is when inflation is driven more by supply side issues than by demand side. But still, nevertheless, that is a tool that central banks have at their disposal, and the one which has proved most effective historically. If we obviously look at the supply side factors, we've mentioned oil and petrol prices in South Africa, we've mentioned food as well. Of course, we also have issues around electricity and other state-administered prices as well, which do push the inflation rate away from that 4.5 midpoint, by the increases in those sectors being a lot more than 4.5% year on year.
So we've heard some moves from, the electricity minister around stability at Eskom, and the outlook is that things are going to get better over the next couple of months, even though load shedding, by all accounts, is going to be with us for a long while still. Talk to us more about risk mitigation in terms of, avoiding a situation where, the SARB has to decide, no, this is not going to be a year where we're going to begin rate cutting.
Look, I think for South Africa, the international interest rate cycle has also been delayed in terms of when interest rate cuts were expected to occur in the US, for example. So it's not something that's abnormal or unusual. A lot depends on the weather. For South Africa, we know we can't forecast the weather with great accuracy. We're not weather forecasters or agricultural economists necessarily, but even in those areas, there's uncertainty. If you look at what's being written, if you look at reports, in other words, we haven't got the results for the third estimate for the field crop, for example. That will come out only towards the end of this month, and that will give us a sense of whether South Africa has to unusually import maize. Now, why that's a problem is because internationally, maize prices are very high for white maize, and of course that's a staple food in South Africa. So you can see where the risk actually comes from there.
And just perhaps to close, Annabel, we are in the situation where we're looking for relief, and at the same time We have some challenges inside the economy, and these are, even structural challenges on a wide range of things. I mean, you talked about crop and fuel and so on, but there's so many other things as well that South Africans are dealing with at the same time. I'm not sure if policy changes, again, take a long time to have a real impact on the ground. It's, like trying to turn, a massive ship around. What are some of the opportunities that the government or others have to try and create an environment where we can deal with some of those inflationary pressures, ease that, and create an environment that's more conducive to having those cuts?
Look, we're certainly seeing that these inflationary pressures are coming from overseas. And of course, that obviously is not something that we can control. The impact possibly can come more from the rand exchange rate. But again, South Africa would not try and control its currency. And in fact, countries which have tried to have control over their currency have actually seen themselves taken out of the knees by speculators. It's a very difficult thing to do. Instead, what you'd actually like is to have a stronger economic growth economy, one in which there's more investment, more foreign direct investment, more foreign money flowing in, which obviously strengthens the exchange rate, along with more exports going out of the country as well. And that's where government can do a lot of good work and is already doing work in terms of resolving the electricity crisis, along with the crisis at the ports and the rails. We're not saying these crises are over or near over, but we're saying that government is doing good work along with business in the government-business collaboration. And of course, that type of work, does seek to improve South Africa's export growth and economic growth, as well as obviously then having a more positive investor environment.
Annabel, thank you so much for talking to us today and for sharing your wisdom. A lot of people who think about how much their repayments, their mortgage repayments have gone up exponentially over the last few years. We'll really be looking for this kind of relief. So we'll see what market moves are made. And my apologies for referring to Annabel Bishop as Linda. I suddenly had the iconic Annabel Linda in my mind, so I hope that Annabel forgives me.